Everyone repeats it like a settled fact. Tamil identity is ancient, older than kingdoms, older than empires. But here is the part no one says out loud. In genetics, the place where history is supposed to be proven, not believed, science has never officially called it the oldest. Not once, not clearly, not without hesitation. And that silence is not accidental. Because when scientists look at Tamil DNA, they don't find something young. They don't find something borrowed. They don't find a story that neatly begins somewhere else. They find depth. Too much depth. So deep that it doesn't fit comfortably into the language science prefers to use. Migration, arrival, replacement. These words work well when people clearly come and go. But what happens when the data refuses to show a clean arrival? What happens when the genes don't look like visitors, but like something that was already waiting? This is where the discomfort begins. Early South Asian genomes, especially from the southern regions, behave strangely. They don't collapse into simple timelines. They don't disappear when new cultures appear on the surface. They don't reset when languages change. They stay. And staying is dangerous to certain stories, because persistence suggests continuity, and continuity suggests presence. And presence raises a question science is careful not to rush into. What if these genetic signals are older than the categories built to explain them? What if they predate the frameworks used to study them? This doesn't mean scientists are hiding something. It means they are standing at a boundary. A boundary where naming something the oldest stops being a technical claim and starts becoming a civilizational one. History would have to shift, centers would have to move, old assumptions would weaken. So instead of conclusions, there is caution. Instead of declarations, there are pauses. But pauses speak too. Because the deeper researchers go into Southern South Asia, the clearer one thing becomes. The story does not start where we were told it starts. And if you're someone who feels that history has always been slightly incomplete, if you sense that some truths were left unnamed rather than disproven, then this silence should unsettle you. Because the real mystery is no longer whether the evidence exists. It's why every path leads deeper, yet no one wants to say where it truly begins. And to understand that hesitation, we have to go back before identity, before language, before memory itself, to the very first humans who stepped into South Asia and never really left. Long before names existed, before tribes, before gods, before language itself, humans were already moving. Not north first, not through mountains and rivers. They followed the edge of the world. Around 70,000 years ago, small groups left Africa and stayed close to the coast. They walked beside the ocean, generation after generation, eating what the sea gave them, sleeping where land met water. This was not an invasion, it was survival. And that path led them south, into the Indian subcontinent, into places history would later call peripheral, but genetics would quietly recognize as crucial. Because South India did not behave like a destination, it behaved like a shelter. In most regions, ancient genetic signals fade. They are overwritten by later arrivals, mixed until they disappear, broken by time. But in the deep south, something unusual happened. The earliest human lineages did not vanish. They stayed, not untouched, not isolated, but preserved. Certain ancient haplogroups, among the oldest branches of the human genetic tree, appear again and again in southern populations, not as rare fragments, but as living threads, still present, still breathing through modern people. This does not mean South India was the origin of humanity. Science is careful about that, but survival tells its own story. Because when a lineage survives better in one place than anywhere else on Earth, it forces a question no model likes to answer too quickly. Why here? Why did these early genetic signals endure in the south while fading elsewhere? Why did later migrations mix, but not erase them? Why does the deepest human past remain most visible here? Researchers notice these patterns. They publish them carefully. They avoid dramatic language. Because survival is not the same as origin. But survival over tens of thousands of years suggests stability, and stability suggests something more than chance. It suggests that while cultures rose and fell on the surface, while languages shifted and beliefs changed, the people underneath never fully disappeared. And that creates a problem for history. Because most histories prefer clean chapters, beginnings, endings, replacements. But genetics tells a slower story, a story where nothing truly ends. And if these earliest human lineages survived so clearly in the South, if they remained visible through every later wave of change, why do our histories barely mention them? Why do later narratives speak louder than deeper truths? The answer is not simple, because what came next did not arrive once. It arrived in layers. When scientists finally tried to explain South Asia's genetic complexity, they didn't tell a story. They built a model. Two broad components: ancestral North Indian, ancestral South Indian, ANI and ASI. Important to understand this clearly, this was never a verdict. It was a tool, a way to describe patterns, not identities. But models have a strange power. Once named, they begin to feel real, fixed, final. And that's where memory started to blur, because Tamil populations do show something distinct. Not purity, not isolation, but continuity. Higher ASI-related ancestry compared to many other groups. Not untouched, never untouched, but layered, absorbed, carried forward. What matters is how that mixture happened. The timelines don't behave like invasions. There is no sudden genetic break, no sharp replacement, no moment where one population disappears and another takes over. Instead, the data shows overlap. Slow blending. Generations living together long enough for memory to change before bodies do. This is uncomfortable for dramatic histories, because it suggests identity wasn't formed by wiping people out, but by absorbing them. Cultures arriving without erasing, languages spreading without killing genes, power shifting on the surface while continuity stayed underneath. Tamil identity, in this light, looks less like a fortress and more like a river. It didn't stop what flowed into it, it carried it. And here's the quiet problem. The ANI-ASI language, useful as it is, can hide something deeper. By focusing on mixture, it distracts from what remained stable across that mixture. The southern continuity becomes background noise, ever-present yet rarely centered. So discussions turn into binaries, north versus south, arrival versus native. Who came first? But genetics doesn't support those arguments cleanly, because what the data actually shows is this. Even after multiple waves of movement, even after languages changed, even after identities reorganized, something in the South stayed remarkably consistent. Not frozen, not pure, but continuous. And that raises a more difficult question than invasion ever did. If Tamil DNA was never isolated, if it was always absorbing, always mixing, then what exactly stayed unchanged? What held long enough to give this identity its depth? The answer isn't in genes alone. It's in cities buried under modern assumptions. For a long time, southern India was placed at the end of the story. Civilization was said to arrive late here, after the north, after the plains, after the script was already written. Then Kiladi surfaced, quietly at first. A dig site along a river most people had never heard of. No grand announcement, no dramatic reveal. But the dates didn't behave. Layer after layer pointed to a time that was not supposed to exist in the South yet. Contemporary with early urban centers of the Gangetic Plains, not centuries later, not as an imitation, at the same time. That alone was unsettling. Then came the objects, everyday things. Bricks made to a standard, drainage patterns, signs of organized living, evidence of trade reaching far beyond the region, and writing. Not ceremonial inscriptions, not elite symbols, but marks of daily life. Literacy that didn't depend on northern templates, urban planning that didn't wait for permission. This wasn't a village becoming a city. This was a city already thinking like one. And that's where the resistance began. Not because the findings were weak, but because the timing was wrong. Kiladi arrived too early. It challenged a sequence history had grown comfortable with: north first, south later. Center first, periphery after. Kiladi refused that order. And here's where the silence deepens. Because Kiladi is not just about bricks and pots, it's about people. If genetic material from Kiladi can be properly sampled, it doesn't just answer a regional question, it speaks to global human history. It can tell us whether cultural continuity in the South also had biological continuity, whether the people living there 2,000 years ago are still present in their descendants today. That possibility is heavy. So the hesitation isn't about archaeology, it's about consequences. Because if Kiladi people resemble modern Tamil populations genetically, then the idea of late Southern development doesn't just weaken, it collapses. The timeline shifts, the center moves, and the South stops being a recipient of civilization and starts looking like a parallel source. That is not a small correction. That is a rewrite. And yet, Kiladi doesn't stand alone, because cities don't rise in isolation. They connect, they trade, they move, and if Kiladi tells one half of the story, the other half waits beyond the land. Because Kiladi wasn't isolated, the sea tells another story. When we imagine the ancient world, we're taught to see oceans as edges, as limits, as walls that stopped people from going further. But for the people of the South, the ocean was never a wall. It was a road. Long before modern borders, long before political maps, coastal communities along South India were already looking outward, not just north, but sideways, across water. Genetic signals and cultural traces quietly point in the same direction, toward Sri Lanka, toward island chains, toward the wider Bay of Bengal. This wasn't a one-time journey. It was movement over centuries. South-to-south connections existed long before north-to-south dominance became the story we remember. And that matters, because when you follow coastal Tamil populations, something becomes clear. Their genetic makeup doesn't look like a group waiting to be reached. It looks like a group already in motion. There is continuity, deep, rooted, unmistakable. But there is also expansion, layered contact, traces of exchange that don't come from conquest, but from connection. These were not passive people standing at the edge of land. They were navigators of rhythm and season, readers of wind and current, communities that understood the sea well enough to trust it. And with movement came mixing, not erasure, not replacement, but contact that left marks, subtle, human, lasting. Yet early genetic models struggled to see this, because for a long time, history was written as if land mattered more than water, as if movement only counted when it marched across continents, as if oceans erased identity instead of carrying it. The Indian Ocean world didn't fit that logic, so it was sidelined. But the data doesn't forget. It shows that Tamil coastal populations held onto ancient genetic continuity while still absorbing influence from across the sea. A balance that's hard to explain if you assume people stayed still. And that creates tension. Because if movement was constant, if contact was normal, if the sea connected more than it divided, why does history keep freezing Tamil identity in one place? Why are Tamils so often described as rooted but not mobile, ancient but not expansive? Something doesn't add up, because identity didn't survive here by staying still. It survived by adapting, by letting genes change where they could, and holding on to something else where they couldn't. And that something else wasn't DNA. Because language survived what genes allowed to change. Language is often mistaken for blood. If words survive, people assume bodies stayed the same. If a tongue endures, they imagine a population untouched. But language doesn't work like DNA. Tamil survived not because genes stayed pure, but because memory did. As people moved, mixed, married, traded, and absorbed others, the language stayed strong enough to carry identity forward. It didn't resist change by freezing. It adapted, standardized, deepened. This is the part history often misunderstands. Because when early historians saw an unbroken language tradition, they assumed an unbroken population. They read continuity in grammar and projected it onto biology, but genetics tells a different story. DNA blends quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand loyalty. Language does. It chooses what to remember. It decides which stories survive. It keeps names, rituals, metaphors, and values alive even when bodies change beneath them. So Tamil identity wasn't preserved by isolation. It was preserved by resilience. People came. People stayed. People merged. And instead of erasing what existed, they learned it, spoke it, passed it on. This is why Tamil feels ancient in a way that isn't fragile. Not brittle like purity myths, but durable like a living system. And this durability created confusion, because later narratives looked at language and assumed biology. They treated culture as if it were a genetic fossil. They mistook civilizational continuity for racial continuity. That mistake shaped textbooks. It shaped debates. It shaped identity itself. Suddenly, who you were was reduced to what your ancestors supposedly were. Complexity collapsed into bloodlines. History turned human stories into biological claims. And in that process, something older disappeared. The deeper genetic layers, the ones that didn't map neatly onto language, were pushed into the background. Not denied, just ignored. Because they made the story messy. And history prefers clean stories, clear beginnings, clear replacements, clear winners. So if language preserved identity so effectively, if it carried memory across centuries of mixing, what erased the older genetic narratives beneath it? Why do we remember the words, but forget the deeper people? The answer lies not in DNA or linguistics. It lies in how history chooses simplicity over truth. At some point, complexity became uncomfortable. So history simplified it. 2 words were enough. Aryan, Dravidian, clean, opposite, easy to argue about, but genetics never agreed. Because populations do not move the way cultures do, and cultures do not map neatly onto DNA. People move in fragments, families, not armies, traders, not templates, marriages, not mass replacements, genes follow intimacy, not ideology. The binary model suggests one group arrived and another stood still. One spoke, the other listened, one replaced, the other disappeared. But the data refuses that story. What it shows instead is layering, movement without erasure, change without extinction. Different groups arrived at different times, mixed at different speeds, and settled into existing social worlds rather than destroying them. No clean handover, no genetic reset. And this matters deeply for Tamil identity, because Tamil history does not require an enemy to explain itself. It doesn't need to be defined in opposition to anyone else's arrival. It doesn't need a before and after shaped like conflict. Tamil identity formed through continuity and absorption, not resistance and replacement. But political narratives needed sharper lines, so nuance was sacrificed. The Aryan Dravidian framework became more than a model. It became a weapon, a way to claim priority, purity, or victimhood. Genetics was pulled into arguments it was never meant to settle. And in that noise, something subtle was lost. The understanding that ancient South Asia was not a battlefield of identities, but a long negotiation between them. That identity here was not fragile, it was flexible. And flexible systems don't break when something new arrives, they incorporate it. So when the framework fails, and it does, it leaves behind a dangerous question. If the basic structure we use to explain South Asian history is wrong, if the categories themselves distort reality, what else have we misunderstood? What other stories were built on convenience instead of evidence? And that question becomes impossible to ignore, especially when bones start talking. By now, the question feels unavoidable. If the South holds such deep genetic continuity, why haven't ancient genomes from Tamil Nadu rewritten the story already? The answer isn't conspiracy, it's chemistry. Heat destroys DNA. Moisture breaks it apart. Time finishes the job. Tamil Nadu's climate is almost designed to erase genetic evidence. Warm soil, seasonal rains, acidic conditions that dissolve bone before it can speak. In colder, drier regions, DNA sleeps. Here, it decays. So when researchers look for ancient genomes, they don't find silence, they find fragments, broken sequences, incomplete signals, and that creates a dangerous illusion. Because absence of evidence starts to look like evidence of absence. Older models remain unchallenged not because they are proven right, but because the data needed to challenge them is hardest to recover here. Sampling gaps widen. Studies focus elsewhere. Narratives stabilize by default. This is how outdated ideas survive, not through strength, but through delay. And it hurts most where history runs deepest, because every failed extraction feels like a door closing on the past. Not forever, just long enough for assumptions to harden. But here's the tension. Technology is catching up. New methods, better sequencing, smaller fragments now readable where silence once existed, and slowly, very slowly, signals are beginning to surface. Not enough to rewrite history yet, not enough to make bold claims, but enough to disturb comfort, enough to suggest that continuity did not end where we thought it did, enough to hint that the genetic past of Tamil Nadu is not missing, only damaged, which raises the most unsettling possibility of all. What happens when sequencing finally succeeds? When fragments connect? When patterns become undeniable? Because some results are already emerging, quietly, carefully, incomplete. And incomplete truths are the most dangerous kind. At this point, science still refuses to make a declaration. And it's right to hesitate, because what the data suggests is subtle, not dramatic, not convenient. Tamil DNA does not point to dominance. It doesn't claim superiority. It doesn't demand to be first in a hierarchy. What it shows instead is depth, layer after layer of human presence, preserved more clearly here than in many other places. Not because nothing changed, but because not everything was erased. This is where misunderstanding begins. Depth is often mistaken for origin, but science is careful with that word. Being a genetic archive is not the same as being the birthplace of humanity. It means something quieter and in many ways more powerful. It means early human lineages passed through this land, and enough of them stayed. Enough of them mixed without vanishing. Enough of them left traces that time could not fully destroy. Tamil populations in this light are not a starting point of humanity. They are a record of it, a living archive where some of the earliest chapters remain legible, and that demands a different kind of dignity, not pride built on supremacy, but respect built on endurance. Because to survive tens of thousands of years of movement, mixing, climate, and cultural change, without losing continuity, is not an accident. It's resilience. But here's where tension quietly returns. Science is approaching a naming problem. At what point does preserved depth become something that requires reclassification? At what point does survival itself challenge the frameworks used to explain human history? Because categories like origin, migration, and arrival were built for cleaner stories. They struggle with places that refuse to reset. And if the oldest surviving genetic signals remain most visible here, if the deepest layers of human history stay readable in the South, what happens when science can no longer avoid that conclusion? What happens when preservation becomes impossible to ignore? That question doesn't end here. There is a temptation at the end of stories like this to offer an answer, to close the circle, to name the truth and let everyone go home satisfied. But this story doesn't allow that, because Tamil DNA is no longer just about Tamils. It has become a test case, a place where the deepest questions of human history quietly gather about how we move, how we survive, and how much of ourselves time can erase. What we're seeing here is not a claim of being first. It's something far more unsettling. It's the possibility that some parts of humanity didn't reset the way we assumed they did. That while borders shifted, while empires rose and collapsed, while languages transformed and cultures blended, certain genetic signals endured. Not frozen, not pure, but carried forward, generation after generation, like a memory the body refused to forget. This reframes identity in a way history rarely does. Not as something owned, not as something defended, but as something inherited unevenly, preserved accidentally, and understood only in fragments. Tamil identity, seen through this lens, is not older than everyone else. And it is not separate from the rest of humanity. It is older than borders and younger than genes. A reminder that what we call ancient is often just what managed to survive long enough to be seen, and that survival does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides beneath language, sometimes beneath culture, sometimes beneath stories that feel complete but aren't. What makes this dangerous, intellectually, historically, is that South India forces a global question. If early human footprints remain clearer here than elsewhere, if continuity can survive without dominance, if identity can persist without isolation, then how many other histories have we misunderstood? How many places were dismissed because their evidence didn't fit the models we built? And how many truths were not erased, but simply never recognized? Science hasn't finished this story. It may not even be ready to. But one thing is already clear. The past we thought we knew was cleaner than reality ever was, and if South India preserves humanity's earliest footsteps, what did the rest of the world forget?